Hi. It's so nice to see everyone again virtually, and you're tuned into a fresh season of Music and Chat with Shirley Ong. That's moi. So please say hi in the live chat and let us know where you are tuning in from. Don't be backward and coming forward. I already see a few friends of our guest today. Steve Turner. Hi, Steve. Nice to meet you. We have, I thought I saw, Never Call. Hi, nice to meet you as well. Mark Sykes, nice to meet you. Let us know where you're tuning in from, though, so we know how we may address you, as in good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. If you have any questions for the guest or for me, please put these in the live chat. As you know, there is a lag from real time to broadcast time, so it takes quite a few seconds before we receive your question for me to then post it in the live stream, and for our guest to then process the question and spit out an answer. So get there first. So the live music scene has returned. Hooray! And I'm proud to say that Music and Chat is 2 years old. I will continue to broadcast thanks to your support. Thanks for subscribing to my channel and being a part of my viewing audience. I will do my very best to work diligently for you. Please help me pass the word around, though. Thank you very much. So hi to more friends. Don't stay invisible now. Jump in the live chat and say hi, please. So it's 9:34 a.m. in Singapore. For our Aussie friends on the East Coast, I believe it's 11:34 a.m. Hi, Aussie friends. So what I usually do at the start of my live stream is play something live for you, which is great for you because when I can't get to your part of town, I can still play for you. I have picked a movement from my upcoming album. It's being worked on right now. I've already finished writing the album. It just needs to be parts just need to be put in place by several other musicians. And this movement's called Isabel 2. It's a short one because I'm trying to save the minutes for our guest. He is full of anecdotes, and I bet you we got plenty of questions for him, so I won't steal his precious minutes from him. This piece is called Isabel 2. Let me bring up my theremin cam. So that was Isabel 2 from my upcoming, I've pet named it a concerto. Some of my friends are not too keen on it. but I shall hold on to it with dear life. I hope when the album is out, you will support me in owning a copy. Anyway, let's move on. Our guest today is Chris Meyer, who has been involved in the world of modular synths since the 70s, but you all know all about him already. I am just doing a little spiel for the newbies, the newcomers to Chris's world. Anyway, along the way, he worked at Sequential Circuits, and we all know this. He also worked with DigiDesign, Marion Systems, and Roland R&D in the US, and several others. He has pulled himself away from his synth wonderland to chat with us this morning. Aren't we just lucky? So let's welcome Chris in. Hi, Chris. Many of us know and are familiar with your music-related work, but I would like to jump into your work as a motion graphics artist in the 90s first, and you did run a studio with your wife Trish, and I do have a clip that you sent me of the work that the studio did. The studio was called Cybermotion then. It's been renamed as Krish Design, a portmanteau of both of your names, I suppose.
Oh yeah, people, when they see us in public, we always merge our names together, particularly if they've been drinking.
Okay. We shall touch that subject soon, the drinking part.
Let everyone know this is graphics done like over 20 years ago, and actually a soundtrack I had done when I was doing everything on samples rather than using modular synths and stuff like that. So it's really quite old, but it's fun to always go back in time.
Okay, cool. We'll watch it and then we'll delve into it a little. So let's do that.
Two persons inhabit our heads, residing in the left and right hemispheres of our brains. One side of the brain takes synthesis, spatial perception, and music, while the other side gets sequential, verbal, analytical, and computer-like activities. These two half-brains are linked together so that everything experienced by one hemisphere is then available to the other. And then it contains, of course, one other factor, which we simply call the emotion. This has been used to conclude that talented people are not smart or analytical. This is not my conclusion, so don't blame me if you don't like it.
So that was a fun clip to watch about the left and right brain in the commentary bit with clips complementing the clips really nicely. But Chris, as you know, I do also have an animation and video background, and I'm always intrigued by people who are involved in AV and practice both interest areas, because it is it's very complementary, and yet I don't often find people who do practice or work in the two areas. But I want you to, if you may, describe some of the projects and the clips, and perhaps at the same time explain what motion graphics is to those who are new to the term. Thank you.
Yes, certainly. I got into the video industry because whenever I was involved in music, I always saw visuals as well in my head. So even when I was young, in a dark room with speakers, on either side of my head, listening to the latest Tangerine Dream album or whatever, I always saw graphics. And I was really thrilled in the early 90s when it became possible to start doing sophisticated graphics using desktop computers. Before, that used to be the domain of people who had really, really expensive equipment. You had to go to an expensive studio and rent time on machines to do that. And just like home recording really changed how many of us could make albums and broke down the doors to who could record music, the same was happening with video production. So that was really exciting to be part of that early transition from studios to home computers. Motion graphics basically describes any part of the video you see that's not reality. If editors usually take things shot on a camera, assemble a story out of it. Visual effects artists take what was shot on the camera and change part of it, change the background, add a poster to a room, add a dinosaur, something like that. But the motion graphics part of it is adding the text, the overlay, the things that are obviously not real but are supposed to graphically communicate what's happening as part of the storyline, even if it's just a commercial, because even a commercial is a 30-second story. So I always describe motion graphics as putting video together this way rather than editing, which puts video together this way.
I noticed, at least from what I read, that you also participated in some 3D animation work.
Yeah, a lot of what you saw in that reel was also 3D work in addition to 2D work. 2D, traditionally shot video, is just two-dimensional. It's on a flat screen. 3D was fun to create some worlds and inhabit that world with video and other objects. Particularly, we had a lot of work with corporate clients who would do things for large trade shows. Xerox, we did stuff for Apple, companies like that. And they would want to have something really eye-catching as part of the big displays over the booths at trade shows. So creating 3D worlds and then populating those 3D worlds with maybe their clients or their own products, things like that, was a fun way of going. So we used an old program called Electric Image way back in the day. Electric Image was $7,500 each copy to show you how expensive things were back in those days. And we later on moved to Cinema 4D. But it was fun to integrate the graphical 3D world with what just is shot on a camera or what you can do with text, things like that.
So I started animation with an Amiga computer because it was affordable and yet very powerful. But I noticed you used an Apple system, and from what I read, After Effects was the mainstay of your studio.
I started with an Atari ST because it was very suited towards music. The Amiga was very suited towards video. It was one of the earliest computers that some of the earlier video switching boxes appeared on, were driven by Amiga computers. But there was a little tiny company in the state of Rhode Island in the US called the Company of Science and Art, COSA. And they're the ones who came up with the idea of After Effects. And the idea was to take video and treat it as what was called object-oriented. Do it and apply any layers of effects you want to it, nest it into something else, combine it, but everything was live. You could go back down the stack to the original, change out the footage, and everything would render back through the stack again. And this was around 92 or so, and it was quite revolutionary. And one of the reasons they involved myself and my wife, Trish, who's also a musician, is because we knew sound. There's a lot of visual people, particularly people who come from a photography or, say, a magazine advertisement or a text background, who are not used to the concept of timing. What's the pacing? What's building tension, releasing tension? Musicians, we deal with this all the time. Our world is, how do we spread events out over time? How do we build tension and release tension? And I found myself that musicians were excellent at creating video and other motion graphics because we had that sense of dynamics, a sense of timing. It was interesting working with other photographers, like, how long should this be on screen? And they go, 20? Like they're trying to guess a number as opposed to knowing, oh, that's on too long or that's on too short. They don't have the feeling the musician does. So it was a fun transition for Trish and I, both musicians, to get into doing graphics because we already had that feel of doing a beat and building the tension and releasing tension. One of the funnier stories is we had a client bring Trish in to teach their animators how to dance so they could understand where the beats were and what was the one so they could time their graphics to the music. Otherwise, they had no idea of how to make their graphics line up with music. So she had to teach them how to dance.
I've just taken rhythm for granted. I just never imagined anyone couldn't have rhythm, or especially for an animator, because animator has to deal with time and pace.
Well, that was part of the, back then it was the Wild West of starting to do motion graphics and video on a desktop machine. Is previously people were using Photoshop to edit their photographs. People were using Illustrator to create logos and other graphics like that. And suddenly this time element got introduced that they never had to deal with before. So that was part of the interesting thing about the early 90s, but also is part of the reason that my wife Trish and I got into teaching motion graphics, is because we wanted to take this army of new users and elevate their skills to take on the people who had previously had these really expensive studio jobs. And it used to cost $200, $250 an hour to rent a studio to do graphics before. And we kind of wanted to break down those walls and make it accessible to more people.
That's wonderful. So with these projects that you had, how did you divvy up the work between you and your wife, Trish? Did you do much the same thing? It was like, oh, well, you take that project and I'll take this one. Or did you say, well, we'll do these tasks and you do those tasks?
There's some overlap, but there's definite strengths. Trish is a better designer than I am, to be completely honest. She's also loves typography. And even today, she's into calligraphy and doing very advanced modern abstract calligraphy. She just did the calligraphy for my most recent album cover that I just put up in Bandcamp yesterday. So nice. Anything doing with text, that's Trish's job. 3D, which was a more technical thing to learn how to manipulate those programs, she could do 3D, but I would tend to do more of the 3D jobs myself. And maybe a little bit more with the music stuff. Like one of the things you saw in that clip was a little promo for The Simpsons, where we tried to make it look like an old advertisement. There was a fruit drink called Fruitopia that did kaleidoscopes of fruit flying through air. And the producers of The Simpsons, we want to do that, but with donuts and stuff from The Simpsons. So it was fun going through the soundtrack and just spotting where were all the beats and transitions, and then how do we animate the clips, transition between clips based on the music and just propelling the piece along.
Do you have maybe one or two projects you were very proud of then and still do now? You look at the clip and go, yeah, I'm still really proud of that one.
I'm really proud of the Simpsons clip because that was a lot of fun. Got a lot of praise, started a lot of arguments at trade shows about, was it original? Was it an homage to this other commercial? Was it a ripoff of a commercial? It was really kind of funny. Simpsons are controversial anyway, so it was fun that promo had a lot of controversy around it. And the other thing that I was really proud of, there's a 3D disc world that appears inside that clip, where there's a lot of things on a spiral world and then little factories around it. And that was like my first really heavy 3D job. I'm really proud of how that turned out, because I was having to take this flat world and wrap it around into a circle and make things travel around the circle and populate that world and do the camera moves around this world. And that was, there's a series of science fiction books called Discworld, which I hadn't even heard of at the time, but I was creating Terry Pratchett's Discworld. But that's what I was creating, was this flat Earth that's populated by all these factories and other graphics. And I'm really proud of that one because that was one of the earliest ones I did.
Do you still do any of that kind of stuff?
We don't do it for clients anymore. We got out of doing motion graphics for clients because, quite frankly, Hollywood is a very difficult business. The producers are basically psychotic. They're very worried about their jobs. They're very high strung, very stressful, and it's also a very ageist world. I belonged to what was called the Broadcast Designers Association for a while. And when I joined, they were very proud. They just got this new survey back. It said, we interviewed both types of members, young guns in their 20s and grizzled veterans in their 30s. And I was 40 at the time. I was like, oh, okay, I can see the writing on the wall here. But now that I'm doing music, I'm so happy to be in a world where age is not a negative issue. it's been really lovely to get re-immersed in music, and particularly the modular music world, because everyone is so supportive of each other, regardless of music style, regardless of age, regardless of gender identity. It's such a supportive world. It's lovely to be in. Um, so I am doing graphics for myself now. I create music videos for a lot of my performances, and I'll go ahead and just shoot them myself here in my studio. Myself or Trish will do additional graphics for it. My most recent music video was for a piece called The Cave that was premiered as part of Synthfest France. And Trish did all these animated lines and rotoscoping around part of the footage. And that's, we're enjoying doing that as opposed to having, crazy clients that we're trying to talk into not jumping out of the window.
Cool. So speaking of the satisfaction of being a musician, hooray! A decade or so prior to your motion graphics period, you were in the synthesis chapter of your career as engineer with, at least I'm going to tackle a sequential circuits chapter. How did this job fall into your lap?
It didn't fall in my lap. I had to fight
gradually
for
slid.
it. I had to fight for that job. Well, when I was young, I loved music and I loved electronic music. My brother had exposed me to music. He exposed me to electronics. I really wanted to do that for a living. And when I announced I want to do music for a living, I want to be a recording engineer or a musician, everyone said, no, you don't. You really don't.
What did they say no?
They said, you're not going to make any money. If you're a recording studio engineer, you're just going to sweep the floors. You're going to be the T-boy. You're going to hate it. I was like, okay, well, I seem to have an aptitude for this engineering thing. So I went to engineering school strictly with the idea of that would finance a hobby of doing music. And then shortly after graduating from engineering school, there was an advertisement from Sequential Circuits. Actually, before that, I applied to Sequential. I said, oh, hi, I'm a fresh graduate from college. Here's my resume. Would you consider hiring me? And they wrote me a very nice letter. No. But then later, when I'm working at a robotics company, actually, a friend pointed out, oh, look, there's this ad for this company called Sequential. They seem to make musical instruments. They're looking for someone who knows MIDI. What's MIDI? Do you know what MIDI is? Like, yeah, I've read one article on MIDI. I know what MIDI is. And I said, but they've already turned me down. He said, no, try again. So I wrote a different letter with a real attitude of like, I know this and I know this, and what you're doing here is great, but this could be better, and I can help you do this better. And they flew me out to California, and they gave me an interview, and they hired me. So I originally thought, oh, I'm going to be very mercenary. I'm going to get an engineering degree to finance music as a hobby. And 1 year later, I'm helping make musical instruments. So that was not planned, but great.
That's wonderful. Did Dave Smith interview you, or did someone else? Did you have to go through an interview, I suppose?
I had to go through a very tough interview. And we've been talking about Dave Smith. As people who don't know, Dave Smith, founder of Sequential Circuits, unfortunately passed away this past Tuesday, and it shocked quite a few of us. And something that's been going around is Dave liked his tequila. And a lot of people have been toasting Dave by drinking some tequila. I know it's breakfast time for you. What do you have there? You have
I've got water. So
maybe milk with some Bailey's Irish cream in it or something like that, or
yeah, I couldn't find any of those, not in Singapore quickly, but to Dave Smith,
definitely.
For all good things.
So the story of how I got hired at Sequential is Dave was indeed the person who shepherded MIDI into being. He and a couple engineers prepared a paper on what was called Universal Synthesizer Interface, USI, presented it at an AES, Audio Engineering Society show. And he tried to get other American manufacturers to come along with it. No one did. Everyone said, no, my technology is better. You should use my technology. No, my technology is better. You should use my technology. And everyone just fought. So instead, he turned to the Japanese, Korg, Roland, Yamaha. And they were much more pragmatic. They could see the market that could form out of that. So instead, Sequential, along with Roland, who contributed their DCB, their digital control bus specification, Yamaha and Korg who agreed upon the MIDI 1.0 specification. But by then, Dave was sick of MIDI because it was very political. He had to go through these big struggles, and he had a company to run. So that's why they're advertising, we need someone to take over MIDI at Sequential. And back then, actually, the biggest problem was the MIDI bugs in all of the early instruments because the instruments wouldn't talk to each other properly. Ranges for mod wheels were mismatched between instruments. So I was originally hired into the service department, not engineering, to go fix the bugs in the original instruments in Sequential that had MIDI in them. And part of my interview was they sat me down with a schematic and a book on assembly language, because all the instruments were written in assembly back then. I said, okay, this is an example of what one of our keyboards is. Write us a keyboard scanner. I'll be back in 20 minutes. And for the first 10 minutes, I was in total panic, just like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then after I called, I said, look, I know how to do this. Let's just do it. So in 10 minutes, I wrote a keyboard scanner. And Scott Peterson, who was head of service, who was interviewing me at the time, came back and said, oh, we do this now. This is a little more efficient, stuff like that. But he hired me based on that. And I worked actually technically in the service department until I fixed all the bugs in the existing instruments. Then I started moving over to working on the newer instruments. And eventually, through a lot of turmoil, Sequential going bankrupt and all this, I got moved into engineering. Dave Smith, who had been moved to the front office in management, came back into engineering. And that's when I actually got to work with Dave on instruments like the Multitrack, the Prophet VS, the Studio 440, Prophet 2000, instruments like that.
Wow. My mind is still swimming. I did have a section on MIDI, but we'll leave that for later on because you did drop the MIDI word. But I did really want to look at vector synthesis, obviously, because a lot of us here are fans of it. So now what I got here. Yes. Did you actually get to work with Dave at all?
Yes, I did. Yeah, he came back into engineering and ended up taking over a lot of the hardware designs for the products. And that was fun. And the amazing thing about Dave, even back then, and Dave definitely mellowed more with age. He was a lot edgier when he was younger. He was willing to let his engineers come up with ideas and run with them. And there was a period of Sequential when he said, look, we've got these analog instruments, but we're getting undercut price-wise by Roland and Korg. And then Yamaha's just come out with this digital DX7, and there's things like the PPG. He knew that Sequential needed to come up with a digital instrument. And he was thinking to himself, like, well, we need to have something that can change the timbre, change the wave shape over time. But that's, as far as I know, that was as far as he got with it. And I was actually talking to another engineer who said, tell me how other existing digital instruments work. So I was explaining to him, this is how the Fairlight's actually an additive synthesis instrument. This is how this instrument works. And I was showing him how the PPG works. PPG has a row of waveforms lined up and could scan through them with an envelope or with an LFO or with Aftertouch or whatever. And as I was drawing this out in my notebook form, my hand went like that. And I said, what would we do if we could actually crossfade in 2 dimensions instead of just 1 dimension like the PPG? What would that sound like? So I went home and I had a ragtag collection of equipment, an Oberheim 2 voice, a couple of Dennis Electronics control voltage processors, some custom PCAs, a Pyosynth, and Korg equipment. And I used all of it to build this big patch, monophonic patch of 4 different oscillators and ways of crossfading in between them on every single note, or by using LFOs and things like that. And recorded a demo tape and took it into the office. And everyone commented about how terrible my playing was. But other than that, they said, but the sounds, those are interesting. We've never heard those sounds before. And, Dave gave us the free rein to that's going to be our digital instrument then. Let's go. And that shows how much power he gave his young engineers back then. Yeah, and speaking of Dave, over on my Patreon channel, patreon.com/learningmodular, I made a public post recounting some of my remembrances of working with Dave and some of the things he did. And it's been interesting to watch a lot of the people who posted about Dave, because a lot of people only knew him from meeting him at trade shows and after the original Sequential went out of business. And when Dave came back, founding initially Dave Smith Instruments, and now he got his name back in Sequential Circuits, he was a very different person. He was much more mellow, much more easygoing. He was very tight in the early days because, he was running a company and the company was having difficulties. And although Dave is actually a nice person, he does not suffer fools gladly. If you're wasting his time, if you're not keeping up, he will get impatient with you. He wants you to be at his pace. And once you got used to that, then it's fine. If you're willing to run at his pace, then there was no ego and there was no issue and it's perfectly fine. But a bunch of us young 20-something engineers, we were naive and we just didn't know, and we thought, he's part of management, and he's difficult. And I look back now and I realize, my God, the patience Dave had to work with all of us back then when we were so naive. and still give us so much trust, to basically design instruments for his company. I'm just amazed to look back at that now. And I'm really glad that when I came back into the music industry after motion graphics, that I got to reconnect with Dave, and he was just a wonderful person to deal with. It was really nice to see that he could come back, do it again, be very successful, and enjoy it.
Did he ever give you any advice or maybe a platitude or something like that, a mantra or something that you still hold dear to?
No, Dave did not praise you. He expected you to do well.
Right.
That was the part of the thing of working with Dave.
Okay.
But you had to read between the lines to realize, oh, he doesn't do that for everybody. I was really quite shocked that he offered me stock options in the company before I really knew what that meant or what that was all about.
Yeah.
The time that we had the NAMM show when we were going to premiere the Prophet VS, the person who was the engineering lead on it was saying, it's not ready, you can't take it to the show, And Dave pulled me inside and said, look, I need you to get this Prophet VS to the trade show. I need you to take the machine out of the lab, put it in your car, and drive it down before the engineer catches up with you. And I look back now and I realize, this was the company's new product that we were hoping was going to keep us in business, and he's trusting me to be the one to get it out and hand deliver it. But Jeff back then was like, okay, let's try it. You just don't know at the time that these little moments are important, later on.
Wow, I guess it's the process of designing, marketing, producing, sales, and all that, isn't it? That unless you've done it before, it's why do we have to do that now?
Well, a lot of people think that just coming up with an idea is the biggest part. And in reality, it's difficult to sell a product in the world. It's the same for music. It's one thing to write a song. It's another to make an album and get people to buy that album. Those are two very different things. And it's the same thing with coming up with ideas for instruments. You can come up with an idea for an instrument, but to actually design an instrument, make it something that's easy to use, manufacture it, market it, distribute it, support it, there's layers and layers and layers on top of that initial idea that I think a lot of people don't realize how difficult it is.
I find that an interesting comment because I've come across people who worked with me before as a team, and they would say, oh, I came up with that game idea, but what they did was they sketched, a little code that they could put into the entire game where there were 10 of us.
It's really common for people to think that what they see is the whole picture. I'm sure you've heard the story of the blind men and the elephant, where each person has a hold of a different part of the elephant, like the trunk, the tail, the leg, the body, and they're trying to describe an elephant to each other, saying, no, you're wrong, it's like this. No, I'm touching it. It's not like that at all. It's like this. And it's the same thing in reality. It's the same thing in working for a company. I gave a talk at the Synthplex show about the Prophet VS, and to my surprise, Dave Smith sat in the audience during my talk.
Wow.
And I could tell that I was telling stories that he was unaware was even happening at the time. And later he pulled me aside and said, well, let me tell you what you didn't know was going on at the same time.
Wow.
And that's when I really realized that reality is like that elephant. You're seeing just the part that's in front of you, but reality is far more complex with a lot more moving parts and a lot more people involved.
So with a better understanding of the man called Dave Smith, did you get an idea of his approach to synth design then, based on your knowledge of the way he was?
He was, this may sound very trite, but he was very interested in it being musical. He was originally a bass player in a band, and then he got a mini Moog, and then he wanted a polyphonic mini Moog. He wanted things to make his mini Moog better, so he designed a programmer for it. He designed a sequencer for it. These are the initial Sequential Circuits products. Sequential, a sequencer. That was his first thing. And the Prophet 5, he wanted it to be a lovely instrument. Dave was into classical music. He wanted things like the Prophet 2000 to play back realistic samples so that he could play classical music. And even later on with this later Prophets from Sequential, his priority was always on the musicality of the instrument. And I think that's important because a lot of engineers in particular get a technical idea. Say, I have this new technical idea, let's see what sounds we can make with it. And then let's see what musicians do with that. Instead of thinking about, what do musicians want? What do they need to create music, rather than what can this technology do? And I think Dave was much better about being on the side of, what do the musicians need?
Was he involved in the marketing side then, since he was as interested about what the user might want?
I imagine in the very early days he was,
Right.
because but then the company grew over time, and it got its own separate marketing department. And I don't know what happened in the management meetings, but I got the feeling that he was not directly involved necessarily. He was not a hands-on thing in the marketing, and there became, frankly, conflicts between engineering and marketing about what products should we be making and what the specifications should be. And there was a time at the early Sequential when we were chasing price. The Prophet 5 was a beautiful instrument. It cost about what a new car did back then. Then instruments from Roland and Korg and the such really came in at a much lower price than the Prophet 5. So Sequential got into this fight of, how do we get our price down? The Prophet 600 was one of the first attempts. It was one of the first instruments with software envelopes, software LFOs, anything he could do in software instead of buying chips to put into the circuit board to get the price down. And then later on in Sequential, our big partner, Doug Curtis, who did a lot of the custom chips for filters, oscillators, envelopes that went into the instruments, actually got a job to come up with a sound chip for video games, for arcade games. There's a company called Ballet who did a lot of those big video games in pinball places, and they wanted him to design a synth chip to make the sounds for it. And Sequential said, oh, look, on one chip there's a VCO, a VCF, a VCA, an envelope. That's a whole voice. We can make cheap instruments out of that thing. And on the one hand, some of us consider that to be the dark period of Sequential, because there's all these one-VCO per voice instruments. You couldn't do the detuning, you could not get the fat sound. On the other hand, this is what pushed people like John Bowen, who was the main product reps there, to say we need to put it in cross modulation to thicken up the sound, to make this better. That's where instruments like the 6-track had multi-timbral capabilities, where maybe it had 6 voices, but one could be the kick drum, and one could be the snare, and one could be the bass line, and one could be the lead. And songs like the Eurythmics' Sweet Dreams Are Made of This were done on the 6-track. Using that multi-timbral capability that came out of having those chips. So there's positives and minuses to everything, but there was certainly a period when marketing kept pushing us down that one-VCO path, lower price path, and then when it came back to engineering, we said, let's make higher end instruments for professional musicians like we used to. It did not save the company, but at least we got some great instruments out, like the Prophet VS, the Prophet 2000, Studio 440, Prophet 3000, things like that.
Wow, that's kind of sad that the marketing.
Oh, it was a difficult time. It was a really stressful time for everybody. It's not nostalgic to look back at those times, because it was really tough. But on the other hand, there was a lot of friendship among the engineers, getting through that struggle together.
It's always interesting when you know that marketing and R&D have to work hand in hand, yet you wish one had more power than the other at the right time, but then you can't see the future at the same time, so
yeah, engineers are perfectionists. They're going to keep doing their own thing. We had a saying is that there comes a time to shoot engineering and ship the product. And that's definitely the marketing side. Like, will you stop playing with it and just let us sell something? On the other hand, I've worked for companies who felt that marketing people did not need to know the market. They just need to know how to market, and then they could adapt to whatever the market was. Wow. And I don't agree with that point of view. I really prefer people who are in the industry.
Yeah, me too.
Understand what are the struggles that the customers are going through.
Absolutely.
Because at the end of the day, equipment manufacturers are in a partnership with musicians. You cannot live without each other. And I really think equipment manufacturers should view their job as, how can we make our customers successful? How can we give them the tools they need so they can be successful as musicians? Because that's the only way they're going to be able to afford to buy more instruments and more equipment from us. Instead of saying, well, this is what we came up with, how can we fool them into buying it?
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of instrument design and consumer needs, I'd like to talk about vector synthesis, since we're still at this portion, this chapter of your career. So is it true that the concept occurred during a conversation about a different type of synthesis?
Well, I was educating another engineer about what was already on the market at the time. Because it was actually Paul Retigliano who was the chief engineer of the Prophet 2000. Because even though he was working on the sampler, he knew that down the road, Sequential was going to be doing a digital instrument. And so he was curious to learn from me, because I was the staff historian with manuals for all these different products, say, well, what's out on the market? What have people done? And that's during that conversation is when I started saying, here's what the PPG does. Oh, what if we went in another dimension? But we went as far at Sequential as even looking at the Buchla 400, because Buchla was just up the road from us. We were in San Jose. He's up the road in Berkeley. And they brought in the Buchla 400 and assigned me, like, go learn this instrument and tell us, should we release this as a Sequential product? And it was a very innovative instrument. It had a lot of power to it, but it was difficult for a typical Sequential type of customer to use. Maybe someone who is very much into computer music, or someone who's very much into advanced gestural performance, like a Mort Subotnick, would love that instrument. Someone who says, look, I need to get up on stage and I need 10 killer sounds to play back our songs, was not going to get along with Buchla 400. And I had to be the person to make that call and say, no, Dave, we should not release this instrument. Our customers would not accept this instrument. But still, we took some of the ideas that were in the Buchla 400, which were interesting, such as looping envelopes and things like that, and said, how can we simplify these from an engineering perspective into something that's much more musical and easier for musicians to use. And Josh Jeffy did that. He came down with the 5-point envelope in the Prophet VS and with the loops, and I still think it's one of the best parts of the Prophet VS is its envelopes, and it should be copied more, and I'm shocked that it's not.
So the reason why I brought that previous question up is that perhaps we could have a quick demonstration on your VS since you set it up. And for the newbies,
there over my shoulder? Yep.
Yeah, sure. For the newbies in particular, hold on, don't go across yet. For the newbies in particular, and I'm always trying to expose old and new synthesis methods so that they realize that there is a spectrum of processes that they can play with and don't be limited to one. And I'm always really proud, like a peacock, to show off the power of the old but strong concepts. And don't disregard the ones that came before them just because they have new toys to play.
Yeah, don't disregard them, but also don't treat them as like some sort of religious object that, you know, oh, they got it right the first time, and let's honor what the original instrument was, because there's things on the Prophet VS we wished we had done differently.
I want you to talk about those too.
Sure.
So let's have a quick look at the VS. In particular, I was telling Chris viewers in our Skype test session that I did take a screenshot of the matrix panel for those who are not familiar with how it works on the Prophet VS, but Chris has kindly offered to show us the real thing instead of me showing you the picture.
So in many ways, the Prophet VS is not too dissimilar from other so-called East Coast synthesizers before. There's oscillators, filters, VCA. This unit happens to have stereo and a stereo chorus, but it's a similar voice structure. And a lot of the early East Coast voices had basic waveforms like sawtooth waves, square waves, etc. And the famous Prophet 5 string sound is basically sawtooth waves, detuned, going through that lovely Curtis analog filter. And we can still pull up a sawtooth wave on a Prophet VS and get that string sound. But an advantage of a digital instrument is that you can have waveforms other than what is easy to do with analog electronics, which is basically why we have the sine wave, the triangle, the sawtooth, the square. They're easy to do in analog, not necessarily what we want to do as musicians. With digital instruments, we could go ahead and have different waveforms, such as sampling different format or vocal sounds of people and get choir sounds. So that's the type of sound you cannot get from a Prophet 5 because this has different waveforms in it, being a digital instrument. But what set the Prophet VS apart from other instruments is it didn't have just 1 or 2 digital waves. It had 4 of them set up in a diamond. I originally called this the diamond patch before Josh Jeffy came up with the name vector synthesis. And you can crossfade in between those 4 waveforms, including having envelopes that loop continuously back and forth. And that's how you get really amazing sounds like this one. Or like this one. And here you can actually hear it crossfade between not only different wave shapes, but different tunings for the 4 corners to create those really, really heavy sounds. But the other thing I really liked about the Prophet VS, and what I was going for with vector synthesis, was the ability to say, I want my attack transient to start on this sound, but then I wanted to morph over to this sound for my sustain, and then morph over to a different sound when I release a note. That to me was the real goal of vector synthesis, is to be able to say, go between different sounds over the life of a note. And one of my favorite is this one called Pac Bell. Our phone company in California at the time was Pacific Bell. That's why I use this name. So that's where we have that lovely struck attack, but then have that nice sustained sound that's much more like a traditional synth. Tell me if that demo came through okay first, before I continue.
Yes, it did. Perfectly.
Good. Now, for me, one of the other important parts of the Prophet VS, in addition to this ability to crossfade between 4 different sounds and to have them tuned independently, that's an important thing that Josh Jeffy came up with. My original idea, just to save on hardware, was to have all 4 corners tuned the same, but there's no detuning, there was no chorusing, there was no fatness. And Josh Jeffy, who was the lead engineer in this instrument, tried a bunch of ideas and said, you know, we're going to have to make them separately detunable. That's the only way we're going to get a fat sound. And I'm glad he did, because that way in each of the oscillators, we could have different waveforms, but also different frequencies and different detunes for each of the waves in those 4 corners. Let me go ahead and bring up that volcanic sound, for example, show you. Those are all tuned the same, 23, heavy sound, different octaves, detunings, etc. The other thing that's important is the envelope inside the Prophet VS. And I really think this should be ripped off by more people, to be completely honest. First off, most ADSRs, or for that matter even attack decay function generators, start at 0 level, fade up to a peak, then fade back down either to sustain or back down to silence. But we realize a lot of percussive sounds start at a level other than silence. You know, they immediately jump up to a level, like the percussive tones on an organ, piano, guitar, I can go on and on. And you were wasting an entire stage of the envelope to set the attack time down to 0 just to jump up to that initial level initially. So Josh came up with the idea of having a key on level that could be set anywhere. It didn't just start at 0, you could start it anywhere that you wanted to, and then the attack time went up to the peak. So you could have a fast attack and then a gentle swell. So that was one difference between a normal ADSR and what's in the Prophet VS. The other thing was very useful, and hopefully you can see it on the graphics here, are these different bars, is the ability to loop back and forth between stages inside an envelope. So rather than go through attack, decay, hit the sustain level, and stay there until you release a note, the Prophet VS has the ability to say, well, let's back up and go back down to where decay was, and go back up to where attack was, and go back to the start of the note, and keep going back and forth between those different levels. So it's like getting a free complex LFO that kicked in every time you played a note. Now there's a lot of envelope generators, particularly in the modular world today, which just loop forward. They just keep going in a straight line. They'll jump back to the attack, go to the decay, jump back to the attack, go to the decay. But if those levels don't line up, you get a sudden click in the sound as if like you're using a sawtooth wave for your LFO. The backwards and forwards looping in the Prophet VS, we use for maybe 95% of the sounds that had looping on it, just to get those wonderful sustained tones, like. Goes high, and it goes back. So I think the envelope is also one of the secrets of the Prophet VS. That's not necessarily part of vector synthesis, but it's an important part of what the Prophet VS sounds like.
Wow.
I guess the other things I'd say, there's a few things we wish we had in this instrument that we didn't get into it. We wish we had some way of doing sync or pulse width modulation. We wanted to take those analog ideas and move them into digital if we could in the next generation of the instrument, but we never got that opportunity. Newer instruments like the ASM Hydrasynth do have the concept of pulse width mod and sync inside a digital wavetable instrument, so that's kind of exciting. The other thing we wished we had done on this instrument is we liked the idea of these attack tones so much, and we already had the Prophet 2000 sampler. We said, wouldn't it be great if we could sample short attack transients and put those at the heads of sounds and then go into the Prophet VS's looping envelopes between normal wavetable waves, static sounds. We did not get a chance to do that, but the Roland D50 with their own linear synthesis had that. No communication between us. They developed that independently, but we were really disappointed when Roland came out and said, oh, we really wanted to do the sample attack going to sustained tone, but they beat us to it. So that was some of the things I think are special about the Prophet VS's sound. There were some issues with the Prophet VS, mainly because the hardware, we were pushing the limits of what we could do with analog style hardware back then. Even though this thing had 4 oscillators per voice, they were actually fed into sample and holds as analog voltages and then mixed that way before being passed on to the filter. And that part of the circuitry had a lot of issues in it, created a lot of noise, created a lot of strange sidebands and things like that. The other thing that was kind of a bit of a problem, again with technology and how fast we could run these instruments, is in the Prophet 2000, when we played the highest notes, we did not have enough resolution to get the intonation correct on those high notes on the Prophet 2000. They'd be several cents sharp or flat from where they're supposed to be, even for equal temperament, let alone just intonation. So Josh said, well, rather than being out of tune, maybe there's a way to dither a clock, to say, well, divide by 3, divide by 3, divide by 2, divide by 3, divide by 3, divide by 2, to average the clock speed that we need for high notes. But unfortunately, that resulted in all sorts of really weird sidebands. When I play this up high, you can hear some additional tones that shouldn't be in that sound. There's some additional metallic sounds that are out of tune with the original sound of it. So those are some of the things that are imperfections in the Prophet VS we wish we had done better. But I still, I love this instrument. I still think it has just an amazing bass to it particularly. I've had mine refurbished recently with new capacitors and just... It has a heaviness to it and a heft to it that is hard to find in a lot of other instruments today. One other secret I want to pass along that the Prophet VS shared with the PBG is there's different ways of reading out oscillators at different speeds in a digital instrument. The way that modern instruments like the Korg Wave Station and things like that do it is they have a constant sample rate running. And they basically sample rate convert, you could say, the pitch of the oscillator to what that final rate is for the entire instrument. And in the case of the Wave Station, there's a 30-something sample rate, so its bandwidth was a little bit restricted to maybe 12K. The way that the Prophet VS and the PBG worked was they would take a wavetable and just play it back at whatever speed you wanted with no adjustments downstream. As a result, if you played a really, really low pitch, what are called aliases, duplicates of the harmonics start to appear in the very high frequencies as well, but they're in tune with the fundamental. And there came a case when they were working on the Prophet VS hardware in the lab, and I walked in one day and I said, oh, that sound you're playing, that's the PPG sound. we need to get that sound. What's that waveform? And they said, it's a sine wave. But what it was a sine wave tuned so low that its alias, its ghost harmonics reappeared in the audible spectrum. So you had a harmonic down here and a harmonic up here with nothing in between, and they were in tune with each other. And to me, that was part of the magic of the PBG sound, the Prophet VS sound. And now there's a new synthesizer that's PBG-like, that's being shown to NAMM, etc. Its name has escaped me, that has reproduced those shortcomings of these earlier instruments to get that beautiful in-tune aliasing to create that really hefty, cutting sound of these early instruments.
Wow. Anyone with questions while Chris is at the instrument? Please put it in the live chat. Everyone is stunned by your amazing demonstration and all the anecdotes to go with it. So sit there for a few seconds, because just in case there are questions.
Oh yeah, there's a lag, but I'll point out a few things too. Like this old bumper sticker on here, the sticker is one of the original Prophet 5 promotion items. I stole some of these from Sequential Circuits to put on the Prophet VS. Because at the time I thought it was funny. I got the old Prophet 5 sticker on a brand new instrument. But now this thing's from the late 80s, so it's an old instrument as well. So
yeah.
And I don't know if you can tell in the lighting, but if you see these different scratches that are coming through my instrument here, that was from an earthquake. I lived in California during the Northridge earthquake, and above my Prophet 5 was an Oberheim expander, and it fell on the Prophet and moved around. That's all these squiggles you saw was from my expander being shook by the earthquake and drawing lines on my old Prophet VS, including the dent down here.
Wow.
And rather than getting it repainted or refurbished, I kind of kept those marks just to remind me of those days.
Yeah. I do have a question from your friend Steve in Melbourne, Australia.
Yeah.
And he wants to know if it has a good flute sound.
It does, actually. I don't know where it is in the presets because I tend not to play flute sounds. But in addition to having all the waveforms that we put into it, including sine waves and triangles, etc., and the ability for the user to mix their own waveforms and generate a composite wave from their mixture, we also did put noise in the Prophet VS as well. So one of the four corners could be a noise waveform that you could have as a component of the sound or as a chiff at the start. Let me see if I can remember. There is a sound in here called, I think it's down here, right? Come on. There's a noise chiff sound in here somewhere, if I can't remember where it is. I'll see if I can find it for Steve. Feedback's from my favorite patches as well. Oh, it must be. Looks like I'm not going to be able to find it, see, but there is a flute sound in here as well. Oh well. Not that we need flutes, but yes, you can do it because we had noise in addition to all these other waveforms, and vibrato, including Aftertouch, etc.
Aftertouch, my favorite.
Yeah, we had a problem with the Prophet VS in Aftertouch. Two problems with it. One, this was our first instrument. No, that's true. It's our first instrument with Aftertouch. And we got the design of the sensors wrong. The voltage was too high, and the points on the pressure sensors were too pointy, and it would burn through the pressure sensor pads underneath the keyboard. So there was a retrofit to turn down the voltage and have a little bit better contact area so that Aftertouch would live. The other problem is that this metal case is a little flimsy, so that if you put the arms of the keyboard in the middle of it, the instrument will actually bow like this over the arms of the keyboard, press the key bed up, and Aftertouch is always on. If you move the arms out beyond the edges of the keyboard, now the instrument bows like this instead, and Aftertouch is not on until you press down and actually engage it with your fingers. And we were in Stevie Wonder's studio shortly after this came out, and the engineer was dying because he said, Stevie's really mad at me because this thing has Aftertouch all the time. I can't turn it off. And we said, move the arms on the stand. And it was fixed, and he was so happy.
Wow. So in the pre-production testing, when you made prototypes and all, that wasn't discovered at that stage?
No. I've got this we had them in flat tables in engineering.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
We didn't have them on a stand that hadn't been set up properly. Maybe it had been set up for, say, a Pro 1 with a 3-octave keyboard. Someone would put this in its place, Now the arms are in the wrong place, and now the whole thing was bending. Yeah, but Sequential has a history of not the best metal work in the earlier instruments. The early Prophet 10, that huge twin manual instrument, big thing, there was a joke that you could pick up one corner and the other three corners would stay on the table. That's how flexible it was.
Wow. I have a question that's unrelated to the VS, but it's from Val. I believe it's Val. Val is a drummer. He wanted to know if you had anything to do with the Yamaha RY30 drum machine.
I had nothing to do with the Yamaha RY30. I did have involvement with a couple drum machines at Sequential. I updated the MIDI handlers in the original drum tracks drum machine so that you could do things like use the pitch and mod wheels to change the tunings of the drum while you played it from a keyboard.
Oh, nice.
When we made the tom drum machine, I made this thing where you could play chords of drums or decide how many drums to stack at one time when you played a note. And then I'm the one who was the chief engineer and laid out the specification for the Studio 440 sampling drum machine. At the time, this was a classic marketing versus engineering fight. So we had this little tom drum machine. It was a cheap drum machine, could only do 4 sounds at one time, but it was a fun machine. It was just a blast. They said, that's great. Put 2 of them together and make that the next drum machine. We said, Lynn is coming out with the Lynn 9000 that could do sampling and all this stuff. We have a sampler. We should do a sampling drum machine. So I tore up marketing specification and rewrote their spec to be a sampling-based drum machine and sequencer, measured the Lynn 9000 to make sure the Studio 440 was exactly the same measurements, and said, okay, now we can fit into the same case, so get rid of your Lynn and put our machine in the case in the place of it because we're better.
Whoa. Wow. Gee, we could talk for hours and days. Anyone else with a question while Chris is at the machine, quote unquote?
I love the machine. I'm glad I have my VS working again. I'm not a collector. I get rid of instruments that duplicate what other instruments do in my studio.
Yeah.
But this is the one I'm holding on to.
There you go.
I'm definitely going to keep my VS just because it has a sound I still love today, and I'm planning to start recording with it again later this year.
Ooh, Chris, I've often wondered why the idea of interpolating between 4 sounds, or your concept behind vector synthesis, hadn't been discovered prior to your, we could do that.
So people certainly had 4 oscillators or even more per voice before the Prophet VS. I think what was different about the Prophet VS is the idea of a progression of timbre. Rather than layering sounds and having them all going at the same time, the idea of vector synthesis in the VS was start on this timbre, go to this timbre, then go to this timbre, loop back to this timbre, then loop back to this timbre again.
Yeah.
It was all about timbral evolution. So it's not just 4 oscillators per voice. It's about how do we morph the sound over time in interesting ways, including while you're holding a key down. And to me, that's really important. I get bored when people hold a chord and the sound doesn't change. I want it to evolve. And that was one of the things with the VS, was how does we keep the sound evolving. So if you're a one-finger keyboard player, you can play one note and it'll be interesting.
I have another question from our friend Steve, and it's in line with one I had later on, and it's about the modern take on VS. I'm a Logic Pro user, and there's a soft synth called E2, which uses vector synthesis and the idea that you can create different timbres across the life of a sound, as you are describing. And my students and I really enjoy it because you can immediately get something with just, as you said, hitting one key. So Steve's question is, how do you feel about the modern takes on vector synthesis?
I like a lot of them. I like that some of the people are taking the idea and running with it. Because back then the idea was, how do we take 4 oscillators and move between them to create an evolving sound? And my feeling is vector synthesis should be opened up now to say, what are interesting ways of combining multiple timbres in a musician-friendly way to get interesting tones out of them? And I'm going to walk out of the camera view for just a second.
Sure.
Because one of my favorite instruments is this thing. is something called the VECTORSynth from the Czech Republic. Hi, say hi to yourself. There you go, in the mirror. And they took the idea of moving around 4 sound sources, but then completely rethought the process of why do we have to do it every time you play a note? What if we just kept that evolution going while you played new notes? So instead of the evolution happening while sustaining one notes, what if the evolution happened while playing, and then the timbre would change over time as you played? And I think it's great that they took that concept of vector synthesis and how do you evolve timbre and repurposed it in a different way of playing and a different way of interacting with the instrument. And I love this little blue vector for arpeggios, because I can set up an arpeggio. They have a very intelligent arpeggiator that automatically transposes every note to random octaves rather than just playing one octave and another octave and down again. And I can set up an arpeggio, and it's always evolving and it's always changing. It's, it's kind of like the modern idea of how to make one note interesting. For them is how to make one arpeggio interesting, and for them it was to disconnect the envelope from the note. So the timbre is constantly changing no matter whether you're playing a note or not, or how many notes you're playing right now. I think that's a great idea. And so I think it's great. I'm not a person to say you must absolutely recreate the Prophet VS or it's nothing. I like that Yamaha said, let's get 2 samples and 2 4-op FM chips, and let's put that in there. That was the TG33 and SY22. I don't like that they then said, hey, if 5-point envelopes are good, a 99-point envelope must be better. Because what musician is going to spend time programming a 99-point envelope for every sound? So I think they got that part wrong, to be honest. The wave station is actually very different from the Prophet VS. It basically is a series of 1 oscillator, a wavetable, 1 filter, 1 amp, and then they put the crossfader at the end rather than at the beginning. So you could have 1, 2, or 4 voices in the wave station, each with a full filter and amp chain, and then do the vector-like crossfade between them. So that's why I own a Prophet VS and 2 wave stations and a vector, because even though they're all vector synthesis, they're all interpreting it in different ways and creating sounds that I personally like differently from each other that don't overlap each other, and that's why I have all of them.
Thanks, Chris. There you go, Steve. That's your answer. I hope you're happy with it. We have so much more material to cover with Chris. We probably will have to bring him back for a round 2 where we look just at his gear alone. I think that would be fun. Val has a question on morphing between. Yeah, I think that's the whole idea. Val's question, in case, again, I think Val is interested in vector synthesis, might not have played with a VS before or used vector before. He says, can you use a joystick for morphing between vectors? The answer is yes.
Yes, definitely. And that was, to be honest, Scott Peterson's idea. Scott Peterson was the person who was my original boss at Sequential before I moved to engineering. But Scott, he's a great keyboard player in his own right, and he'd go out and tour as a tech for people like George Duke and people like that. And he was the one that came up with the idea of adding the joystick to the Prophet VS. He said, if we have these 4 waveforms, why don't we give the user a dynamic way of mixing in between them? And I think it's kind of almost funny that you now see the joystick appear on so many vector synthesis instruments, when for us it was an afterthought. It got added later on because we were focusing so much on the envelopes and things like that. But yes, you can use the joystick for live performance. Something that I think is somewhat different about the Prophet VS is there's a mode where you can choose 4 waveforms, use the joystick to come up with a mix you like, and say save, and it will now save that composite wave into a user memory slot. And our idea was you could continue to generate your own waveforms for the VS from the front panel rather than just using the ones we provided to you.
There you go, Val. You need to try one. I don't know how much they go for these days.
I'm afraid to look.
I think our friend Steve did take a look. He made a comment in the live chat. I think he said, I just looked at prices and backed away very quickly.
But yeah, these are under €1,000. Lovely instrument. Future Retro just came out with a new instrument called the Vectra, which is based on the vector synthesis ideas. You can get used Korg wave stations for under $1,000. So there's lots of choices available out there to play with it. I think I'd like to bring up one other, for me, important difference between vector synthesis and a lot of so-called morphing wavetable instruments that are out there today. Is something that was very important to us with the Prophet VS was to put the power in the hand of the user. Is we want the user to choose which waveforms they had for a patch and how they moved in between them. A lot of instruments today just automatically assign a table of waves for you and say, here, just move along these waves we've already chosen. Or you can move this way, or you can move this way, but we've already chosen the waveforms for you. And for me, that kind of goes against the idea of letting the user to decide what world they want to create. And that's another difference between something that's a true vector synthesis machine and just a morphing machine. Now, there's some instruments, like again, the Hydrasynth, which you see one over my shoulder, which allows you to lay out which waveforms you want and then crossfade between them. And that's an approach I greatly prefer compared to a lot of, say, Eurorack wavetable oscillators that say, we've given you 3,000 waveforms and you use these control voltages to move between them. Like, but they're not my waves. They're what you chose. And what if I want this sound to go to this sound, but I have to go through all these sounds in between? And it gives you an idea where I'm coming from. So I want the musician to have a sound in their head and be able to make it on their instrument rather than saying, okay, instrument, what are you going to allow me to do? So there's a lot of powerful instruments, including modular synths, that you can just play around with them and stumble around and randomly come up with really cool stuff. And that's fine. It's just the way I'm wired is I have an idea, I want to realize that idea. And I want instruments around me that let me do that.
Okay, so you know what, Chris? I'm going to feature your modular synthesis section in round 2 because you got lots of equipment there. We can look at more in detail than, gloss over them, which wouldn't give that justice. So I want to move on.
Give people a little sneak peek. There's the studio modular over there, known as the Monster. Poor Monster's not been getting a lot of use lately because I've been out on the road playing, and I've been let's go ahead and blow things up and change the camera one last time.
Okay. Okay.
There's my performance system. That's the performance monitor I go on the road with. Mix interface, Ableton Push, laptop because I run a hybrid system now of using Ableton Live with the modular system, and a few things like a launch pad to control it. But that's the live performance system.
Yeah, I have a video of you at the recent Mountain Skies Fest. Shall I play that one first?
Let's go ahead and play that one.
Yeah, let's do that. So, Chris, the recent Mountain Skies Fest in Black Mountain. Where is my blurb? Yes. Before we play it, I want to give a shout out to our dear friend Gary Yelton, who we miss dearly. Well, at least I do because I'm in Singapore now, and I usually see him twice a year when I drive eastwards from Nashville. But thanks to Gary, we're now mutual friends.
We're friends now.
We're friends now. I also want to give a shout out to Tony Gerber, Paul Harriman, Sally Sparks, and the rest of the gang. I miss you guys, but I hope I'll see you soon. So
this Mountain Skies was my first time to actually meet that crowd.
Oh.
Gary and I have been in parallel paths in the industry for decades. Like, he was a longtime editor of magazines like Electronic Musician. I'm writing for Music Technology, things like that. And it was only Mountain Skies this year that Gary and I had a chance to spend a lot of time together. And it was like meeting a brother. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, Gary's a good person. Chris's performance was an improv loop and sample based one, I believe.
The overall structure was definitely planned out and rehearsed, and then inside each section, I'm improvising inside each section. But there's definitely was a storyline to the entire piece that I played.
Okay, I'll play it first and we'll talk some about it. Okay, here we go.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alias Zone, Chris Meyer on Mountain Skies 2022.
I'm curious about the procedures that you used. There were some samples, some sequences, and real-time work happening there. Would you like to walk us through the performance?
Yeah, I could walk through the performance, and I'd like to just back up a little bit and kind of explain where I'm at now in terms of performing. Because previous to COVID, I used to jam with other people. I would act as the drummer and play with ensembles of other people or just with other individuals. And I'd take over the drum portions of it using previously samplers, then Ableton Live, then my modular, but mainly doing rhythmic stuff. And then when COVID came along, we couldn't get together to play and jam anymore. So I was challenged with how do I create full compositions by myself rather than just being the drummer and let other people play the melodic parts of it. So that's pushed me down this path of creating a hybrid system where I'm using the modular quite often for the lead voices, and all the sequencing's done in the modular. But also maybe hardware keyboards, maybe Ableton Live with sampled instruments inside of it, a lot of individual samples, and constructing pieces that way and coordinating all those bits and trying to figure out how to make those bits play variations on their own like a human musician might, because I really enjoyed improvising with talented improvisers who could change a line, interpret, I'd listen back, change what I'm doing, and have that feedback loop. How could I have that feedback loop with a machine where it was doing variations without me having to manually adjust the knobs? Now, the way a piece like that one starts off is based around a Zuni Indian chant. Zuni is one of the main pueblos or tribes of the Native Americans. And I started with that chant because I thought it was interesting, and I plotted out what notes were in the chant, each individual one, and then the chord progression of the chant, and said, okay, reverse engineering it. Most of those notes are in C minor. It goes from like the root to fifth to fourth to the root down below. Now I have my chord progression. Let's start building a piece that complements those chants, and then start working on sequences, bass lines, etc., based off of that root. Because I treat creating music the way I treat creating visual art. I'm also a multimedia artist, or mixed media artist. And I always say everything I add to the canvas must support the other pieces and must tell another part of the story that the overall piece is telling. And that's the way I feel about music, is every new thing I introduce needs to add to the story that everyone else is telling. So I create sequences and do arpeggios, but I really want something to add variations to things. The sequencer I use over both of my modular systems is something called the vector sequencer. Ironically, it has the name vector in it. It's not based on vector synthesis. By a company called 512, which is ironically based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, just a half-hour drive from me. It was based on a piece of software called numerology, which was a lot of people's favorite sequencer because it could do variations. He programmed into both numerology and the vector sequencer these things called chance operations, where for every step of the sequence you could say, okay, do this variation, like transpose the note, or make it shorter or longer, or louder, or skip it altogether, or mute it. And then what's the probability that's going to happen every time we come to that step? So I could take a sequence that I would like, or just a very simple bass line, and go, if I was a bass player, what would I do to make this more interesting? I wouldn't play the same line every single time. Every now and then I would put in a grace note. Every now and then I would go up an octave on one of the notes. Well, let's go ahead and program those as chance operations to do the variations I would play and put a probability on them. So I can say, now you go off and you play the bass part because I'm busy over here playing the melody. But then let the machine do the sort of changes that I would do if I was improvising with other musicians. And that's the attitude I take quite often when I'm programming all the parts. Even when I'm programming the drums, the kick drum is not the same kick sample over and over again. That one starts off with a large Native American drum. I have multiple samples of it and just occasionally play these different samples as if the person was just like hitting the drum in different locations rather than just hitting it in the middle every single beat. And I take that attitude with all my musical lines. Is what variations would I play if I was the human playing that part? Let's program the machine to play those variations. And then I have it underneath parametric control, particularly on the modular, where I can say, okay, turn the chance probability down to 0, so play it straight. Okay, you've played that line 4 times now. now start introducing the chance operations and start transposing individual notes in the sequence as if it's a guitarist or whatever, starting to riff on the basic theme. And that's my approach to composition and performance, is what would a bunch of humans be doing, make my machines do that. I treat my modular synth or my system very much as like either my orchestra or my jazz ensemble or whatever you want to call it, where I've hired each of you because you each do what I like, but I'm going to rely on you, to now go do your thing while I'm going and playing this other part over here, and I can conduct, saying, okay, now add variation, now go ahead and bring this up an octave, whatever, by changing controls on the modular, rather than using gestures of a conductor.
And they don't argue with you.
Well, yes, sometimes they do. As we all know, these machines can sometimes get cantankerous.
I was curious, for the newbies, I wonder how risky it is to switch to your third camera again.
What do you want to see?
Your setup for that Mountain Skies performance that you did.
All right, let's go ahead and switch, and let's see if it's going to let us switch.
I have a friend, my friend Sam from Sydney, Australia. Hi Sam, I haven't seen you in a long time. Sam wants to know, would you say you are as good with computers as you are with music?
I am good with computers, but I don't want to be a computer operator when I'm playing music. So the way that I divide my tasks up, and unfortunately I don't have the laptop open to show you a project right now, is I actually don't touch the laptop while I'm performing music. I've set it to be my mixer inside here, but then I have a hardware mixer interface with flying faders that I can control the mix live over on a real surface rather than using a mouse. I've set up things like samples to play back, but then I'll use like the push to trigger when those samples play. But anything that I want to manipulate in real time, I then delegate to the modular. So I can go ahead and reach out and change that control while I'm playing to change the timbre, and it's right there without having to mouse around, change menus, etc. I think I'm very good at computers. I do a lot of editing. I put a lot of work into preparing my live session for these sets. And there's things like effects like delays and reverbs inside live that I'm not touching. But when I do want to adjust, say, the echo, I've got something like this 4MS DLD, digital dual delay, where I can individually set for each part how many clock divisions are each of the delays in the individual channels.
Oh, so that's your clocking device?
Well, my clocking device, actually, I send MIDI from
MIDI?
the laptop into the vector sequencer. This is my main heartbeat of my entire system. Its jack expander sends clocks, these green cables, out into all my other devices, my percussion rhythm devices. They clock the delays, they even clock the LFO inside the twin waves, they clock the random sampler. This is a version of Marbles. I'm eventually have a clock Starlap, which is my reverb I can live manipulate. So I have a central clock come from the laptop, and it gets distributed across the system so everyone stays in time with each other. But then I've chosen modules that allow me to change what's happening to that main clock. I really like grids for rhythmic sequences because it allows me to change different patterns, but also change how dense they are. The fill amount from like maybe 1 beat per measure to maybe playing a 16th note pattern to different patterns in between them. I use Euclidean circles to allow me to have different numbers of beats per measure, and it automatically spreads them out for me. So I choose modules that would give me parametric control, but then do something intelligent with that control.
And you were saying that you use Ableton Live with the push. Is that what you...
Yes.
Okay.
I've got the cover on my push right now. I can set it freely. There you are, push.
And
so I'll use the push to trigger the samples and to trigger loops. And I'm also using this as my keyboard controller. When I'm in my studio, I play these instruments. So I've got the real keyboards in front of me and all these different instruments I can play around with. There's a pad controller on the Iridium. There's a pad controller on the Hydrasynth, so I can play those. But when I'm on the road, I can't take all those with me. So I'll have soft synths loaded inside the laptop, including the Wave Station soft synth,
Oh.
And then I'll switch this into a mode where I'll use this as a grid controller to play the soft sensor from the laptop.
On the video itself, I noticed what looked like a Novation launch pad. Oh, that's that, yeah.
This is actually used as a controller for the vector sequencer.
Oh.
The vector sequencer has 8 individual parts or lanes to the sequence, and each part or lane can have a wide variety of presets, different sequences loaded up for that particular lane. I could dive into here and change, let's go to this part, let's change that sequence, go to this part, let's change that sequence. But what the launch control does, and this is some very smart programming that 512 did, is they allow me to have each of my parts as a vertical row, and then each of these buttons is a different preset sequence. So I can change between play me the melody, play me a variation of the melody, play me different sequences, play me different bass lines, just by pressing the buttons up here, rather than having to menu dive into the sequencer while I'm playing.
I just want to let you know that your cabling, or your neat cabling and very colorful cabling, has been receiving a lot of compliments. Another question, Val wants to know whether you've used Max or Super Collider.
I have not. I'm going to switch back to the other camera so I can sit down. I've used Max for Live objects inside Ableton, but I've not gotten into programming my own yet, or Super Collider. I had the idea that I certainly have some modules and some other ideas that don't exist that I have considered custom coding, but instead I've been enjoying working as a consultant for some manufacturers and saying, look, if you're working on this class of device, here's what I would really like to have in it. And I enjoy that collaboration with manufacturers and have them do it rather than me just do it for myself. Because another kind of part of my philosophy is I'm very much into sharing. I don't believe in doing things only for myself. As soon as I find something useful, I want to share it with other people. So that's why I have things like the Learning Modular website. That's why I have my Patreon channel. It's like whenever I'm making discoveries, I'm figuring if it's useful to me, maybe someone else might find it useful. Let's share it with other musicians.
Cool. Maybe I should end the live stream with that part of the chat, the what you're currently doing, and I'll leave my questions on MIDI and your modular synthesis section, where you had pictures of what you used to have in college and what you had late after that, and what you have presently and what modifications you've done to those. I'll leave that for round 2. Is that okay with you?
Yes, that sounds great.
And I hope you guys will return for round 2. Thank you. So
Thank you for sticking out all the problems we've had this time around.
Okay, let's move into your project Learning Modular. Let's do that. I took a screenshot of your front homepage of your website, Learning Modular, so that I could quickly pull it up and our viewers can get an idea of what it looks like and what's available there. As you can see, courses, newsletters, blog posts, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, what happened with Learning Modular is when I was learning instruments as a teenager, I took piano lessons, I took bass guitar lessons, but I took synthesizer lessons as well. And back then, if you took synthesizer lessons, they probably sat you down in front of a modular synthesizer, and you learned that way. How do you build a voice up from scratch? Before you started working within pre-arranged, pre-patched instruments. I happened to learn on a Steiner Parker synthesis system. So that was my background. I'm used to thinking that way when it comes to synthesis. And then I took all these detours, including in the motion graphics industry. And when I came back and saw modulars were resurgent, I saw that there were a lot of users out there who didn't benefit from the same fundamentals that I had. They had grown up in the era where you had all these software synths with 3,000 presets, and you chose a different preset, and if you wanted to edit them, you had to start diving into menus. And they just didn't have the benefit of being taught what is the signal flow, what is each thing doing in here. And I started writing a couple trial articles for the Learning Modular website, and some of the most basic concepts to me, like how do you use multiples, had some of the highest views because no one had taught these basic concepts to people. So it became apparent that rather than just, my plan A was I'm done with working in the video industry. I'm going to go into a cave and just make music for myself, and that's it. And my dear wife said, and how much is this going to cost? And then she said, you know how to teach synthesis. You've done it before. Why don't you teach modular synthesis now? So I came back at it from an angle of, a lot of people didn't have the benefit that I had of that fundamental education. Let's go back and slowly go through the fundamentals again for people, new users, or users who have been doing it for a couple of years but did not know really what was happening behind the panel, and explain it to them. So that became the source of me doing a series of online courses, which were originally on lynda.com or LinkedIn, which are now on the Learning Modular website, a bunch of articles and a bunch of videos. And then I started a Patreon channel where I could really deep dive into stuff. And that started as the traditional, everyone says, here's the brand new module. Let me do videos about how to use this brand new module. There's a lot of people who do that really, really well. Ben Wilson, DivKit, is one example of someone who does that exceptionally well. He's a good friend of mine. He helped me get back into the modular world, actually. I said, well, they're doing that fine. I'm interested in the musical applications of these modulars. How do you compose music with them? How do you perform with them? How do you record with them? I've spent a few years mastering patching my modular. Now I wanted to use my modular. And I kind of morphed my Patreon channel, that side of my brain, or that side of learning modular, focusing on, okay, I'm now performing again underneath the name Alias Zone, which I had done 20 years ago. There's a separate Alias Zone website for just the music part of it. But let me explain to everyone what's behind the curtain. What goes into every single piece that I do, from the composition seed to patching the voices, to performing it, to recording it, to editing it. And let's share that with people. And that's also been well received, and I'm really, really grateful for that. And so that's been my journey. Is like I was fortunate enough to learn modulars when I got into it as a teenager. I wanted to demystify it for people who are getting into it today, because I really don't think you should have to be an engineer to use a synthesizer. I think you should be a musician and a creative person. You have to learn some tech, but once you have it mastered, you can set it aside and focus on making music. And that's the whole idea behind learning modular, is showing you what's going on behind the curtain so you go, oh, that's not a mystery anymore. That's what's going on. And now you can go back and focus on making music.
That's an interesting observation, and I have come across several people who have looked with interest at working with modular synthesis, but they can't seem to get their heads wrapped around the idea that they need to make connections. They're so used to having the connections made for them already that, and they're concerned they will break something, or
they're relatively hard to break. There are ways, and whenever I discover a way to break them, I share how to break it so people don't do the same thing I do. That's part of I do a monthly newsletter as well. When I zapped a couple modules, I wrote in my newsletter, here's how I killed some modules. Let me tell you so you don't do this again. But also, that's why there's a type of synthesizer out there called the semi-modular, Moog Mother 32 being one of the most common ones, where they are pre-patched behind the panel to make a sound. But when you start getting adventurous and saying, I wish the Moog 32 had another oscillator. I wish it had a more interesting envelope. I wish it had a different filter. It has a little patch panel off to one side where you can start adding in those elements using modules. And my basic approach is, I have people say, they look at that and go, I have no idea where to start. And the thing is, when I approach the big modular, I put on blinders. I'm not looking at the whole instrument. I'm looking at, I want to make a sound, I want to make a bass sound. It's one of my favorite oscillators for a bass. Let's go to my oscillator section, pick a couple of sounds from the oscillators, mix them together. Okay, filter. Let's move to the filter section. And I'm constantly have my blinders on and looking at just what I need to do for this sound, rather than looking at the whole instrument and saying, okay, instrument, can you help me make a piece of music? Because that's not a reasonable request unless you have a lot of time and play them, the joke about the monkeys at a typewriter trying to write a nice novel. I prefer to have a storyline in mind and then let the machine help me realize the storyline rather than just rely on it completely. And so if you approach modulars with blinders on, this is what I want to do. I want a more interesting filter. I want a more interesting oscillator, whatever. Then they're much more manageable. And actually, one of the courses I have on learning modular is called Euro Rack Expansion. And the idea is, today in this movie, we're looking at one module. What can this one module do for you and add to your patch and your sonic palette and your vocabulary, rather than saying, hey, now we've got 20 new modules, let's do something with them. I'm very much in like, break it down. What can this one thing do for you? Remember that? Okay, later on when you're composing and you want that one thing, now you know what module does that.
I like that. A brick at a time idea I like that.
Yeah.
So it's not overwhelming. Speaking of overwhelming, we have a question from Val again. Could your lessons be used for software like Realtor VCV?
Definitely. And that's the challenge of the course. And also I co-wrote a book with Kim Bjorn called Patch and Tweak, which is a book on modular synthesis. And the big challenge in that was everyone has a different collection of modules. Some people have software, some people have hardware. We've worked a lot on how do you teach synthesis in a universal way, rather than saying, this module's really cool. Instead saying, well, there's this class of modules called wave folders. This is generally what they do. Here's what to look for in them. Here's what comes in, here's what comes out. A wave folder will do this, now go use your own wave folder. So a lot of the teaching I do in my courses and also in the book Patch and Tweak are based on the idea of, let me teach you the fundamentals of what's going on. Now you know how to approach the one you happen to own.
So for your Patreon site, of course, there is a subscription involved, but it's well worth it. Those of you who would like to subscribe to Chris's Patreon, please do so. Insofar as your Learning Modular website's concerned, is that a paid service, or are they for all to share for all interested?
Well, the Learning Modular website is kind of like a hub that goes out to things. It has a lot of videos and articles on it. It has a modular synthesis glossary on it. So if someone is using a term or an acronym that you're not familiar with, go to the glossary. If I don't have it in there, put it in the comments and I will write a definition for you of that term. But then it points off to different things. Like the courses I have are paid courses, but you have unlimited access to them forever. They're on sale right now. Everyone's having trouble with the crazy inflation going on right now. I decided to cut the prices of all my courses for a month just to make them cheaper for everyone.
Oh, wow.
Same with the Patreon channel. There's literally like a couple hundred posts I've written up there. As soon as you sign on, you have access to all of them. And for $5 a month is the minimum to get in to see all the posts. I think it's a worthwhile thing if you're up there just for 1 month.
I think
but if you stay, I get to share my journey with you.
There you go. So everyone, please patronize Chris's Patreon and Learning Modular website. I've asked my last question because I'm going to save the rest for round 2. Anyone with a final concern, issue, problem you'd like Chris's answer to? I know that the speed of light and speed of sound seems mighty fast, but it still takes some time.
The speed of computer servers is a little bit slower than that, yeah.
So we have a question from our friend Sam from Sydney, Australia. Sam is in cyber security, but he's very interested in this area as well. Sam's question is, a basic setup cost?
That's a good question. Warning, modular synthesis can get very expensive. However, there's things like software modulars, like BCV Rack, where you can get into a software version of a modular at the entry level for free. So you can get in that inexpensively. There's semi-modular synths like the Moog Mother 32, which are in the few hundred to $1,000 range, which will give you quite a bit of exposure to that. There's a few manufacturers of modules like Doepfer, etc., which make relatively inexpensive modules. But it is possible to spend stupid amounts of money on modular synthesizers. The thing is, though, it's like ordering a custom guitar or a custom drum kit, is that as you build your modular synth, it becomes something that's truly your instrument, your orchestra, your set of musicians. And for me, it's my favorite tool to create sounds. I still have hardware synths. I still use samplers. I still have a little Zoom recorder over there to do field recordings of sounds.
But when it comes time to conjure brand new sounds, the modular synthesizer is my preferred way to do it because it allows me to customize the instrument to make the sounds I want and work in the way that I want to work. So you can start for free. Yeah, you can get into a lot of money on these systems, but it's like ordering a custom guitar. Go up on eBay. Couple-year-old technology, people are getting rid of it for cheap.
Yeah, there you go.
You don't need
else?
the latest computer. You don't need the latest tools. You don't need the latest module. You don't need the latest software to be creative. You need to get over your fear. That's the biggest first thing. Is you need to get over the fear of not understanding. Spend some time learning it, and then you'll find it's a very rich area to explore.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We live in a world where we expect to plug something in if we know how to plug it in at all. I know some people who set things up and forget to plug it in and turn the switch on and say, it does not work. Well, is it plugged in and then is it switched on?
There's a lot of instant gratification. And if that's what you want, there's lots of great instruments with lots of very creative presets that you can make fantastic music on. There's lots of great iOS applications that you can run on your phone or run on a tablet. They cost $3, $5, $10. People get up and do entire performances with a $10 granular synthesizer on their iPad. So you don't need to spend tens of thousands of dollars to make good music.
I agree. I think ultimately, as Chris suggested, the VCV rack, I've used that for teaching before. It's really good. I would recommend that as a start. But if you go into the real world where you're buying brick at a time, just remember to buy brick at a time. And that's what's called modular, because you can put together pieces you'd like to use, and you do have to connect them with patch cords. So, and don't be afraid that you're gonna electrocute yourself or something. Go to Chris's website, get some pointers before you get started if you wish. Or it looks like at least in, I know Sydney's not in Melbourne, but you're in the same country. Steve might provide a few tips. Steve has already provided a few tips. He said
Steve leads up the AUCV, Australia Control Voltage User Group for modular synthesizer users in Australia.
There you go. So we have our user group in Australia, at least on the East Coast, with Steve Turner. And Steve says a good start is hybrid, using some modular, some PC, and some other gear like a drum machine or another polysynth. Good idea, Steve. Thank you, Steve. So we've totally utterly enjoyed having you on the live stream, and I hope you had fun too. We shall have you back for round 2 for a more in-depth view on your gear and cover all the other questions that I had for you. And we wish you new exciting projects ahead, and of course just stay safe. I just want to let you know that several of our friends have said thank you. Gary Alton said that was a good one. Thanks to both of you. Oh, thank you. And several others who said thank you. Navikor said he'll definitely return for round 2, and it was a great discussion. Mark Sykes said a wonderful program. Thanks to both. Thank you, Mark. And Sam thanked you too. Thanked Steve. Sam thanks Steve. Well, there you go. I'm sure he thanks you too. So there we go. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, we appreciate your helpful comments and assistance, and all of you for helping tech support the live stream with your feedback. Val thanks you too. Chris, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. From what I understand, when you do that, you get the alerts to the live streams or any material that goes on the channel. So in case you don't see a promotional blurb on Facebook or wherever you usually get your information from, you know that you get the alert from the channel when Chris is back on. You've been wonderful viewers, guys, and stay safe as well to all of you, and I'll see you back on the next program, and particularly when Chris is on. Thank you, and take care, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Here's the applause. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks for joining us.